And certainly Michigan, we're feeling the strain between the two countries more than I would imagine almost any state in the U.S.
A report last week that found those tariffs are costing U.S. automakers $12.5 billion. What has been the impact in Michigan? How is the state surviving given this?
We shouldn't get into a pissing match back and forth.
Michigan Senator Elissa Slotkin just went on Canadian television and openly admitted that Trump's tariffs are hurting the United States far more than many in Washington expected. And that is a remarkable moment. Because for months, the White House framed this trade fight as pressure on Canada. But now, even American politicians from the industrial Midwest are warning that the economic damage is starting to hit U.S. factories, suppliers, and consumers themselves. And this is where the story becomes dangerous for Washington. The pressure is no longer staying inside trade negotiations or political speeches. It is moving into vehicle prices, factory stability, food costs, and the everyday lives of American voters. Before we go further, if you follow Canada-US trade, tariffs, and North American economics closely, subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts below. Did Washington underestimate how much economic leverage Canada actually has? Stay with us until the end, because the biggest shift happening right now is not inside Ottawa. It is inside the United States itself.
I can't think of a state more impacted by tariffs than Michigan, and particularly because of the border and the way we, frankly, integrated our supply chains. We're struggling for the first time in a long time being on different pages on international trade issues. And again, I'm here to sort of say that we have big problems with the tariffs as well at home, and we're trying to push back on some of these things that just don't make sense in the U.S.-Canada relationship.
The comments came from Senator Elissa Slotkin of Michigan during a discussion about the worsening Canada-US trade relationship, and her message was unusually direct. Slotkin admitted Michigan may be one of the states most affected by tariffs because of how integrated Canada and the United States have become economically over decades. She openly stated that industries, suppliers, and manufacturers across Michigan are feeling it deeply as tariffs continue disrupting the system. That matters because Michigan is not a symbolic player in this story. Michigan sits at the center of the American auto industry. Its economy depends heavily on cross-border integration with Ontario through automotive manufacturing, steel, aluminum, logistics, and supplier networks that move components back and forth across the border constantly. At the same time, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is accelerating efforts to diversify Canada's economy beyond the United States through stronger ties with Europe, Asia, and Indo-Pacific markets. That combination is beginning to create a problem Washington did not fully anticipate. Because Canada is no longer responding emotionally, it is responding strategically.
The concern inside Washington is growing because the damage is no longer theoretical. According to U.S. Census Bureau trade data, Canada remained America's largest export market in 2025, buying more than USD $440 billion worth of U.S. goods in a single year. More than 30 U.S. states count Canada as their #1 export destination, including major manufacturing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. That means when trade friction increases, the impact spreads far beyond border towns. Analysts at the Peterson Institute have also warned that prolonged tariff escalation between the two countries could shave billions off North American manufacturing output over time as companies slow investment and redirect supply chains elsewhere. For months, Washington framed tariffs as pressure on Canada, but the reality now emerging is very different. Canada's response is increasingly creating pressure inside the United States itself. Some of that pressure comes through direct retaliation measures, including restrictions targeting American alcohol imports and procurement shifts away from U.S. suppliers. But the larger effect comes from something much more powerful: uncertainty. Modern North American manufacturing depends on predictability. The moment companies begin questioning long-term trade stability, investment slows immediately. Factories delay expansion, suppliers reduce hiring, companies hesitate to commit long-term capital. And the scale of the integration problem is enormous. Roughly CAD $3.6 billion worth of goods and services crosses the Canada-US border every single day. In the auto sector alone, some components cross the border as many as 7 or 8 times before final assembly. That means tariffs do not hit once. they compound repeatedly throughout the production chain.
One of the biggest strategic realities in this entire story is geography. The American industrial economy was physically designed around Canada over generations. Pipelines, rail systems, trucking corridors, electricity grids, energy infrastructure, and manufacturing hubs evolved under the assumption that Canada would remain a stable, long-term economic partner. That creates leverage for Ottawa, whether Washington likes it or not. The United States still relies heavily on Canada for aluminum, oil, uranium, potash, electricity, and critical auto components. American refineries remain deeply dependent on Canadian heavy crude, while U.S. agriculture still depends heavily on Canadian fertilizer supplies. Replacing those systems quickly would be extraordinarily expensive. That is why infrastructure itself is suddenly becoming political. The Gordie Howe International Bridge between Windsor and Detroit has become symbolic of the broader relationship. The roughly $6.4 billion bridge connects one of the most important industrial corridors in North America. The project is effectively complete, yet political tensions surrounding the opening have intensified because both sides understand what the bridge represents: industrial flow and supply chain efficiency. The Windsor mayor openly suggested Trump may be using the bridge opening as leverage in broader trade tensions. Even if partially political, the fact such concerns are now openly discussed tells you how fragile confidence inside the North American system is becoming. And once business confidence weakens, economic damage accelerates quickly.
Another revealing moment came when Slotkin warned Canada about expanding access to Chinese electric vehicles, particularly BYD. Officially, the concern focused on national security and data risks. Unofficially, the concern is much larger. Washington increasingly fears Canada may successfully reduce its dependence on the United States over the long term, and Mark Carney appears fully aware of that leverage. His government has spent months expanding industrial and trade outreach toward Europe, ASEAN economies, South Korea, and Indo-Pacific markets, while encouraging broader diversification beyond the American system. That diversification strategy is already starting to show up in the numbers. Statistics Canada reported that the U.S. share of Canadian exports recently fell to roughly 66.7%, the lowest level on record, while exports to non-U.S. markets jumped more than 9% in a single month. At the same time, Canada posted a surprise $1.78 billion trade surplus, despite ongoing tariff pressure from Washington. Earlier this year, Carney warned that many of Canada's traditional strengths tied to the United States had become weaknesses that must be corrected. At the time, many American analysts dismissed those comments. Now, U.S. politicians are starting to realize Canada may actually follow through on that strategy in a meaningful way. And once supply chains, investment capital, and industrial partnerships begin shifting permanently, rebuilding old dependencies becomes extremely difficult.
This is the part Washington did not fully expect. Canada did not simply absorb pressure and back down. Instead, the economic pressure is increasingly moving back into the United States itself, into factories, supply chains, food prices, vehicle affordability, and industrial investment. And the longer this conflict continues, the greater the political risks may become inside America. Because tariffs are easy to announce during campaigns and rallies, but dismantling a continental industrial system built over decades is something far more dangerous. That is the real lesson emerging here. Not whether Canada can survive economic pressure from the United States, but whether Washington underestimated how much of America's own economic stability quietly depended on Canada all along.
Canada has the advantage of USMCA. They have the best tariff deal in the world. They just treat us unfairly at every margin they possibly can, and the president is out to try to fix that and to reimagine it. But the answer is make your products at home, and you have no tariff.
At a U.S. Senate hearing, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick tried to defend Trump's tariff strategy with a simple line: "If you build in America, you don't pay tariffs." It sounded clean, logical, almost convincing. Then came the response from inside the room.
Tariffs. I've traveled all across New York. People are very anxious about the cost of everything. When you look at small manufacturers, when you look at any small business. These tariffs have been like a ton of bricks.
These tariffs have been like a ton of bricks. And just like that, the argument started to collapse. Because this isn't just about tariffs on Canada anymore. It's about whether the United States can actually function without the system it's trying to break.
So manufacturing is highly complex, and it was created with an idea that the world was much flatter than it is today. Tariffs on key allies like Canada can cripple manufacturers that are domestic manufacturers because their inputs come from an allied country.
The exchange unfolded as Senator Kirsten Gillibrand challenged Lutnick over the real impact of tariffs on American businesses. Her focus wasn't geopolitical strategy, it was economic reality. She pointed to rising costs, shrinking margins, and growing anxiety among small and mid-sized manufacturers across the United States. These are companies that don't have the luxury of waiting years for supply chains to restructure. They operate in the present, and the present is getting more expensive. Gillibrand's pushback cut directly into the administration's core message. She highlighted a critical fact. American manufacturing is not self-contained. It depends on inputs from allied countries, especially Canada. That's where Lutnick's Build in America argument began to unravel, because building in America still means buying from Canada.
The idea behind Trump's tariff policy is straightforward. Make imports more expensive, and companies will shift production back to the United States. Over time, that should rebuild domestic industry and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. But the assumption behind that policy is flawed. It assumes that supply chains can be separated cleanly, that production can be relocated quickly, and that alternative inputs are readily available at scale. None of those assumptions hold in today's North American economy. Modern manufacturing is not national, it is regional and deeply integrated. Components cross borders multiple times before becoming a finished product. Raw materials move along optimized routes built over decades. Disrupting that system is not a switch you flip, it is a shock you absorb. And right now, the United States is absorbing that shock. This is where Canada's position becomes decisive. Canada is not just another supplier, it is the backbone of several critical U.S. industries. The United States relies on Canada for a significant share of its imported crude oil, which feeds refineries designed specifically for heavy Canadian blends. In construction, Canadian lumber remains a primary input, influencing housing costs across the U.S. market. In manufacturing, parts and materials move across the Canada-U.S. border with a level of integration that few other trade relationships can match. Remove Canada from that equation, and the system doesn't adjust smoothly, it strains. Tariffs aimed at Canada do not isolate Canada. They destabilize a shared production network, and that instability shows up immediately in cost structures, in delivery timelines, and in the competitiveness of American businesses. So when Lutnick suggests that companies should simply build in America, he is ignoring the fact that America's industrial base is already built on Canadian inputs.
Lutnick's earlier remark, dismissing Canada and claiming it treats the U.S. unfairly, may have been intended as a show of toughness, but it reveals a deeper miscalculation. Because the data tells a different story. Canada is not exploiting the United States, it is stabilizing it. Energy flows from Canada help keep U.S. fuel markets supplied. Industrial inputs from Canada support American production lines. Trade under USMCA is structured around mutual dependence, not one-sided advantage. By framing Canada as a problem, Washington risks misdiagnosing the system it is trying to fix. And that misdiagnosis carries consequences. Inside Congress, the tone is already shifting. Lawmakers are not just questioning the impact of tariffs, they are questioning the assumptions behind them. When officials like Lutnick struggle to reconcile political messaging with economic reality, the credibility of the policy begins to erode.
The economic impact of this disconnect is measurable. Tariffs introduce friction into a system that was designed for efficiency. Even small disruptions can create cascading effects across multiple sectors. In automotive manufacturing, where parts may cross the border several times,
added costs at each stage can significantly increase the final price of a vehicle. In construction, higher lumber costs directly affect housing affordability, adding thousands of dollars to new home prices. In industrial production, delays in sourcing components can slow output and reduce competitiveness. Across the U.S. economy, these effects accumulate into a substantial burden. Estimates suggest that tariff-related costs can run into tens of billions of dollars annually, depending on the scope and duration of the measures. And unlike theoretical benefits, these costs are immediate. They show up in balance sheets, in hiring decisions, and in the pricing faced by consumers.
While the United States debates how to reconcile its policy with reality, Canada's position is becoming stronger. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has leaned into its role within integrated supply chains. Instead of disengaging, it is reinforcing its importance. Canada is not trying to out-escalate Washington. It is doing something more effective. It is remaining indispensable. That strategy creates leverage without confrontation. The more the U.S. relies on Canadian inputs, the harder it becomes to sustain policies that disrupt those flows. And as global supply chains shift in response to geopolitical tension, Canada is positioning itself as a stable, reliable partner, not just for the U.S., but for a broader set of markets.
What we are witnessing is a collision between policy design and system reality. The Build in America argument works in theory, but in practice, it runs into a network that cannot be easily reconfigured. Tariffs were meant to push the system in a new direction. Instead, they are exposing how dependent that system already is on cross-border integration. And once that dependence becomes visible, it changes the conversation. This is no longer about whether tariffs can influence trade. It is about whether they can do so without undermining the very system they rely on.
The United States is trying to reshape its economic future by pulling supply chains inward. But those supply chains were never fully inside to begin with. They were built across borders, anchored by partners like Canada, and optimized for a different era of globalization. Now, as tariffs attempt to reverse that model, the costs are becoming clear. So the question is no longer whether Build in America sounds right. The question is whether it can work, when America still depends on Canada to build anything at all.